Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Crouch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
38 in the 50 most relevant for AFL Fantasy, SuperCoach and Dream Team for 2025. Nearing a third of the way through the players that I think are the most relevant and important to talk about this fantasy footy pre-season. Are they the players you'd rank in those players? Well, that's part of the point, isn't it? It's about having a conversation about players, looking at all the factors, and then giving you the information to make the decisions for your side and the format you play and the way you choose to play it. Joining me on this podcast, I'm absolutely stoked to have this conversation. It's been a couple of years since we've had him on the Coaches Panel and the 50 most relevant. They took a hiatus for big chunks of 2024. But the pod is back for 2025. If you're an AFL fantasy coach, you know this podcast. And if you don't, friend, you need to subscribe to what they've been doing. Absolute goldmine stuff for years gone by and heading into 2025. Holmesy, nice to see you, my friend.
And Jay, thanks for having me back on. Like you said, it's been a couple of years, but it's always good to be on the 50 most relevant. It really, signifies the start of a season, and there's nothing better being on school holidays and having a podcast to listen to each day as I'm walking the kids around the park. So, yeah, happy to be involved and excited to talk about Nic Newman today.
He's an interesting player, defensive, eligible, and career high for us across a number of different areas of his game last year. A seasonal average in fantasy of a 102.6, meaning in fantasy and Dream Team, it's a seven-figure player. You are forking out $1 million plus if you want to get your hands on Nic Newman, while in SuperCoach, a 101.5, set at a price point of just under $550,000. But importantly, alongside this high averaging, is a guy that played 23 games last year. Not something we're saying about a lot of players, at least in the early days of the 50 most relevant, and some big ceiling scores. A 156 against the Tigers last year was his top SuperCoach score, and you just got to add 5 points and take a few years off, because back in 2019 against the Eagles, a 161 is the career high score in that format, while in fantasy and Dream Team, 152 last year against the Saints was the best he gave us. Just add 12 more points. Against the Eagles, also a career high score, but back in 2023. So maybe that's a team you want to pencil mark him in for. 164. Holmesy, this is a guy that's been in and around the fantasy landscape for a really long period of time. Even when he was at Sydney, he was a player that we were looking at, loving, thinking there's breakout territories, there's premium performances. And now over the last couple of years, while not quite hitting the peak of what he did last year, he's been somebody that's been a really important player to look at for the structure of our fantasy sides, and understandably so, given how much of the ball gets played through him.
Yeah, he's such an interesting player. There's not many players in the comp that you can say that can really take the game away from you if you don't get them at the right time, or you go against them. And that's exactly something that he's been able to do over the last two seasons. We've seen 2023 and 2024 post-bye putting up averages of 110 in the defensive line, which is up there with the top echelon players. And I don't know about you, but 2023, he just snuck under the radar for me. He was never someone I considered. And then all of a sudden he put 5-6 games together at 110, and any chance of competing without him was pretty much gone. And even last year was the same. Your 102 average for the year, it doesn't seem that high, but he had a slow start. And then after round 8, he was going at 110. And if you were someone that got on him at the right time, you were just away to the races.
His ability to put on big ceiling games and to do it consistently is, as you've mentioned, right at the top of the tree of all defenders across all lines. Like, he's third in the league per game for marks last year. So you add that and the fact that he's 11th in the league for kicks and 16th for meters gained, importantly for us in SuperCoach. It's a guy that the ball is coming through him. The way Carlton have played over the past 12 to 24 months, lots of marks, lots of ball use down the wing when he's coming off half back, and then he's pushing up further up the ground and now delivering the ball inside forward 50 at times too. So an equally important part of their ball movement. And then in fantasy, as you mentioned last year, 10 tons, 4 over 120, 4 over 140, and just the one score under 74 all year. And that end of the year was huge, wasn't it? 5 games to end the year, going at 126. So you talk about a guy that doesn't really hurt you with basement and now has a potential to go 120 over a 5-week stretch. Well, you got to get interested in that. SuperCoach, a little bit lower, but still just as valuable. 12 tons last year off that seasonal average of 101. 5 120-plus scores, including a 144, a 147, a 148, a 156, and 2 big scores at the back of the year that really helped. 5-game final average of 114. A couple of sub-50s in there would probably alarm a few coaches in SuperCoach, but understand why. Really, he's a top-line defender for us in fantasy. Top 6 for points and averages last year amongst defenders. Top 12 in SuperCoach for points and top 10 for points, and top 12 for averages. But you mentioned there's been this interesting split around him, is it? I'm keen on your take. There's so many different reasons for why a player pops a run. Is it for you? Is it just the way that Carlton moved the ball? Is it a fixture thing? Is there anything that you can see underneath the surface that is a clear indicator of he pops big in these scenarios, or is it just more coincidental and a little bit of luck?
Look, to the eye, I think it's the way that Carlton play. It seems there's been a big shift in the AFL over the last year or so to play that Richmond-style run and gun, get the ball forward at all costs. But to me, it seems like Carlton don't really have the cattle to play that kind of game, and they tend to beat up on a lot of sides. And when they're beating up on those sides, it's with that controlled, slow ball movement and then able to get it into the forward line where they're so dominant with Curnow and Mackay. So when they're controlling the ball on the back line, he's the first one to get involved in those chains. He's an absolute animal when it comes to those cheap little kicks. He takes the kick outs. He's always trying to be the first receiver from a kick out. He just loves it. So that is the way that Carlton play. Whether they want to play that way this year, in a new year, that's yet to be seen. But that's what we've seen historically. And it is interesting to see there was no Sam Doherty last year, which we'll get into, and there's a few players coming back. There's a rumour of an Ollie Hollands being off the half-back line. So is there going to be the ball there for him? Given the opportunity, of course there will be, but whether Carlton want to play that way, it's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, so true. Like, Doherty comes back into the side after missing, let's call it the entire season. I know he's there for the finals and the very start of the year, but ruling out that year, Adam Cerra missed a lot of football, and now they've also landed in the draft another midfielder in Jagger Smith. And then you've mentioned that there's some talk of some players that have been on the wing. No, let's change up our ball movement. Let's move that off half back a little bit. We'll talk specifically about Doherty and Cerra in a moment, but it feels like there's, with so much of a market share that could variably change, and that's what the preseason is for, to watch, learn, observe, and adapt if we need to. What could any of these variables mean to a Nic Newman, who has, as we've seen, got so much of the lion's share of the ball movement off halfback? If one of those variables go against him, man, spending $1 million in fantasy and 550 plus in SuperCoach, like this could really hurt the start of your year.
Yeah, look, I think with all the moving parts at Carlton, I think that kind of, at least for me, rules him out as a SuperCoach pick. I think if you're paying up that amount of money in a SuperCoach system where you still need to traditionally target some keepers, you'd really be banking on him improving and going 110 and being able to hold him for the whole year. So SuperCoach, I'm not as keen, but AFL Fantasy is where it gets interesting, because we've seen now with how many trades we have, we're able to turn our teams essentially over. The keeper is not a term that we're using as much these days. And what you're really hoping for is that he can start the year off in the way that he finished. He has a good 5-6 week period where he gets out of the blocks. Maybe he goes 110, 115, and then you're away to the races. And then you can have a look at, maybe I do get shifty and trade him out, or maybe other coaches are trying to trade him in because they've missed these scores and you're ahead of the game there. So that's where it gets interesting. And I'm sure we're going to go into it, but he has a very nice run to start the year too.
Oh, you've teased me there. We'll get to that in a second. Adam Cerra moved a little bit into the back line last year. Doherty, obviously out, impacted a lot. They've been without Sam Walsh, at least for the starting month of the past 2 seasons. He hasn't debuted before round 5 in each of the past 2 seasons. Does an Adam Cerra's position, let alone availability, Does that help or hurt a Nic Newman scoring? Because it feels like, to me, Chera, who we've already revealed in the 50 most relevant, is one of the most creative kicks for Carlton in terms of how he sets up the play and the inside 50 entries. Does a Newman and a Chera absence or position play any impact on each other's scoring?
Look, I think it does. I'm a big believer in the market share idea, in that, you know, there's only so much ball to be won for each particular team, and if you're adding in an Adam Chera, who has gone 95 in AFL Fantasy before, but at minimum is a 90s guy. You throw in a Sam Doherty, who's traditionally been a very high scorer as well, mid to high 90s, and then even across bigger than a ton when he's got the defensive role. So there's so many points that you're adding into the team, and you would think that a Carlton would much prefer to have the balls in the hands of an Adam Chera or someone that's a little bit more creative, rather than a Nic Newman that slows it up. And that has kind of showed. So I looked at some of the without numbers, and it is interesting. So 2023, that was Adam Chera's career year. Nic Newman was 31 points better when Adam Chera wasn't in the side. Now, whether that just coincided with him going on that massive run,
sure,
that's up for debate. We're not 100% sure. But even in 2022, Newman was 4 points better, and in 2024, he was 6 points better. So he has shown in the past to be better with when Adam Chera is not in the side, and that does make sense from a market share point of view. But once again, how that lines up in 2025, who knows? And who's to say that Adam Chera is actually fit and healthy?
Yeah, unfortunately, what is it? 5 injury-impacted sub games where he's been booted out with an injury in the past 2 seasons. Yeah, the data might say maybe that would have happened. Maybe it doesn't. We'll see. You mentioned this early fixture. I'm keen on your take, because on paper it looks really appetizing. They play Richmond in the first game of the season that matters in terms of scoring, not in terms of price movement, but in terms of scoring. He averaged in the 2 games he played the Tigers last year, a 131 in SuperCoach and a 125 in Fantasy. Then straight after that, it's the Bulldogs, it's the Pies, it's Eagles, it's North. Those first 3 games, by the way, are Thursday, Friday night games. So there's your VC option that's sitting through there. In fact, outside of the first 7 weeks, he doesn't have a game on a Sunday. So the first 7 weeks, he's VC territories right there, with the earliest game being a Thursday night, the latest game in the first 7 weeks being the first game of a Saturday. So that's helpful. You look at that fixture, do you see that and go, well, there's some money there that can be made and some big banked points? Or are you not too connected or concerned between previous year's scoring history of opponents entering into a new year?
This episode is brought to you by Unstoppable. Discover the inspiring true story about Anthony Robles, who defied every expectation to become a national wrestling champion in Unstoppable, a new original movie from Amazon MGM Studios and director William Goldenberg, evoking the excitement and camaraderie of classic sports dramas and thrilling wrestling matches. Unstoppable features an all-star ensemble cast, including Jharrel Jerome, Jennifer Lopez, Don Cheadle, Michael Pena, and Bobby Cannavale. Unstoppable is streaming exclusively on Prime Video January 16th.
Look, we can go through and we can analyze the run all we like, but in reality, it's off last year's data. Yep. Teams are changing, so you have to take it with a little bit of grain of salt. But I think what we're all kind of banking on is Richmond are going to be horrendous. So that's our round 1. And if you can get that ceiling score to start, then all of a sudden, I think you spoke about before that we seem to have money this year, and everyone's looking for a sort of D1 to spend up a little bit for. If you go a Nic Newman and he has a ceiling game to start round 1, what's everyone thinking? They're going, this is the guy I've missed. Do I jump across? There's the gamesmanship in AFL Fantasy that we're starting to see. It's no longer, I'm picking Nic Newman because I think he's going to be a top 6 defender that I can get at a little bit of value. It's, I'm picking him because I think he's got the run to start. I can get the points on the board, potentially get ahead of everyone else, and then maybe look to jump off a little bit later. So that's the interesting component of it and how AFL Fantasy is played these days.
Yeah, and SuperCoach is becoming more and more towards that again. The limited trades, albeit more than we've ever had over the last couple of years, is enabling that risk profile to be able to take in You can make those more aggressive trade moves. The challenge for super coaches is you've also got an extra spot on field to be able to sort out with the addition of the flex. That will help with cash generation at the start, sure, but you've also got to find another way to get an extra premium into your side at some point during the year. So a new challenge for super coaches to have. So you talked about this just a few moments ago. I thought we should probably pick up on that point about looking for value at the top end, looking for some price points. We want to extract as much money out as we can. And when I look definitely through the forward line and the midfield, it feels like there's a lot of value that's baked in there for us. Our forward lines, it's just going to be vanilla scoop on vanilla scoop with 4, if not 5 of our starting on-field players, almost very similar for the top end serious style coach. Midfield, we'll see some diversification at M1, 2, 3, but again, similar sort of value hunting. And then whether or not you're a set and forget style ruckman or you're looking for some value or a hybrid of the two, depending on 2 or 3 of those variables, it means you're either just chasing 100% value in the defensive line, or what seems to be pretty common is coaches looking for at least 1 defensive premium, if not 2, that we are paying up a little bit for and hoping for that early pathway. And you've mapped out a nice way for us where it could go well for Newman owners with that early Richmond game, a couple of nice fixtures, and things could pop for Newman. Is there a world outside of a potential market share split? Are there other concerns you've got around Newman? Or is it more about, for those that aren't starting him, it's more about they like another option rather than fading Newman because of ABC?
Yeah, look, I think one of the major flags is we have a look at his last 2 seasons and he's been a bit of a slow starter. So is that to do with just the matchups that he had to start the year? I mean, looking at his run last year, he had some pretty tough games to start. So I think he had an Adelaide early. So he had North, Freo, Adelaide, GWS and Geelong before he hit that Collingwood matchup in round 8 and that really got his season going. So was it just a matchup thing? We're not too sure. I mean, maybe it's a coincidence that it's happened 2 years in a row, or maybe he's just someone that starts a little bit slow and then gets into his work. So it definitely is something that needs to factor in. But yeah, like you said, finding someone at the top line of the defenders is tough this year. I mean, the podcasts have all been rattling it off, but Harry Sheasel, clear gun, but what's his role look like at North? A 36-year-old Dane Zorko, can he back it up? You'd be a bit nervous paying up that price tag to start. Sam Flanders, we saw his role shift at the back end of last year to some CBAs and then even to some forward time. And then you're looking at your Jack Sinclair, who's been incredibly consistent. But once again, you're looking at some new players coming into St Kilda. So how does that all look? And then you're looking at, your Luke Ryans and those types, which have their seasons are really tales of 2 halves. They're up and they're down. And if you manage to pick them at the start and they're down, then you're in a world of hurt. So someone like a Nic Newman is appealing if you are playing the run game.
You look at the top end and you go, who could pop early? Well, the matchup at first that gives me the most confidence that they'll maintain their 2024 form and points accessibility into 2025. Richmond feels like the one, and you mentioned this before, that we're most confident that will become the guys we can bully and score off more confidently and easily. He doesn't have that early bye, which some of our other premium defenders have. He does have a history of 120s in multiple weeks. I can see why people would be looking at Nic Newman as a starter. I can also see why, as you've mentioned, the past 24 months would suggest the back half of the year is the right time to go. So is Nic Newman relevant? You bet he is, because anyone that can do 110 plus over a 2-month stretch in SuperCoach and 115, 120 plus over a near 2-month stretch in AFL Fantasy over a previous 2 years is someone you need to put in your relevancy radar to start or as an upgrade option. But where he goes on draft day is so intriguing, because how people approach drafts with different ideologies of locking in an early ruck or getting midfield heavy does ultimately determine when and where and if a defensive run goes. In the AFL fantasy scoring, where do you think he's going to go, Holmesy? Is there a line that you think it's going to be pretty easy, and what is he going to average, do you think?
Yeah, look, I've just done my draft rankings, and although there is a bit of unknown there, I still have him around the mark of the top 6 defenders. I think I have him ranked 7th or 8th. So I think there's something for there. I'm not sure I'd be super comfortable taking him early. I think depending on what pick I have in the draft, I'd probably want to lock away a captain option in the midfield or in the ruck first, and then potentially one of these forward options, considering positional scarcity. But look, I'd be happy with Nic Newman as my D1 if I could get him a little bit later on, down in maybe the third round or towards the start of the fourth. But it's just really going to depend on who you're drafting against and who's available. But yeah, I can't see him dropping off too drastically unless in the preseason we see, maybe an Adam Chera full-time in defence or a Sam Doherty, and then that could completely change things.
Yeah, 100%. Good shout. I reckon the SuperCoach is not too far dissimilar. Maybe just drop him back a positional spot. If he's your D1, you'd hope it's because you've gone really heavy on mids or a ruck or a forward, and he's okay. You're protected in that fourth or fifth round with your D1, whereas more traditionally he'll probably sit in that D2 spot for me. And again, that would be a really strong 1-2 punch if that's where Nic Newman is sitting at D2. Hey, Holmesy, always love talking fantasy footy with you. It's great to have the pod back. And for AFL Fantasy coaches, you got a ton of great stuff for us coming through the preseason. But right now, it's the Holmesy files that you're dropping some great strategy chats with some really well-researched and well-returned results coaches as well.
Yeah, look, the Holmes files have been a favourite of mine over the last few years. It started back before I was even on Pod when I had the fantasy community and just managed to get involved there. And it's kind of snowballed from there. So I think the last 2 years I've interviewed the number 1 and number 2 coaches from the previous year. So you can go back and listen to my interview with Chris and with Tom, which were really valuable. A lot more to do with how they were successful last year, more than what's to come this year. But then getting Mitch from the Ball Boys, who is one of the best fantasy coaches out there, even though he gives away all of his secrets, that chat was really valuable. And then chatting to Selby, the GOAT, Moreira's Magic this week, it doesn't get any better than that. So yeah, go check those out on the Pod channel, and hoping to do one of those a week along with our regular Pod episodes with Harmy and Louie and whoever else I can scramble up for a bit of a chat.
If you haven't had a chance to listen to the pod yet, and you're an AFL fantasy coach, you need to add this to your audio diet. It's one of the best AFL fantasy podcasts going around. And if you already do, then you're missing out on some gold if you haven't gone and listened to some of those episodes that have been dropping already through the preseason and more to come. Holmesy, you're a star, mate. We look forward to chatting with you soon, maybe sometime else during the preseason, if not during the season proper.
Yeah, MJ, thanks for having me on, mate. Really, really good. And who knows, maybe I'll get another episode. It's a tough call up to get, but if not, enjoy your preseason. I look forward to challenging you for a hat or a car later on this year.
Looking forward to it, mate. If you want to go and check out the pod and you're not sure where to find it, we've got all the details of it and the links in the description of this episode. So you don't have to hunt and search. Literally, you can click inside the description of this episode. We've dropped it all there. While you're in there, all the links to keep in touch with us across social media, become part of our Patreon, or get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch. All those things are locked away for you inside the description of this episode. In 30 seconds, I've got a little bit of a clue for you about who's next. But if you're watching this on YouTube, comment below. Let me know what you think about how Nic Newman is going to go this year. Will it be a positive year? What's he going to average? Comment below and let us know. And if you're listening to this as an audio podcast, of course, just get in touch with us across social media. But if you haven't given the episode and the channel a 5-star rating, it'll take you 2 seconds to do, but it makes a big impact for us here at the Coaches Panel. All right, next up, we're getting into the mid-30s. That's what someone that's heading towards 40 would say, right? Mid-30s, yeah, number 37 in the 50 most relevant. Who are we talking about? Well, it's a player that has done something that only a handful or two have done in the last decade. He's been the number 1 ranked player in a format before. Yep, we're heading towards a player that has got pedigree that has been unmatched in at least one season. But this guy hasn't just been number 1 in a format once. He's been a top liner, top 10 overall in more seasons than you would probably think. Who's this top line premium that's not getting a lot of ownership love to start the year? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.